Hi, me and my brother decided to do a quick rebuttal kind of discussion on some of the points that were raised on the programme, The Big Questions. It was shown on TV on BBC on just this previous Sunday, so that's Sunday the 18th of January. And we're just going to go through some of the points, not all of the points that were made that we thought were wrong, but just some of them, as there were a lot of incorrect and fallacious things said. So one of the questions I'm going to start with the host actually was talking about Noah's Ark, and he made certain claims that were quite frankly quite absurd and quite ignorant. And so the second question is, did Noah's Ark lack space, or was there enough space for the animals that were said to be on Noah's Ark, and what kind of animals were actually on the Ark?
Yeah, and I think this is a big question, and many people ask it, and the problem I find is when people ask this, they haven't searched the answer, they haven't even thought through even what the question is, you know. And so what I wrote down is right questions lead to right answers, and so I'm gonna answer this by asking 4 questions and briefly go through the answers, and we'll leave links and videos that go through a lot more thoroughly what we are discussing here. And so my first question is, how many animals would have needed to be on the Ark? And the reality is, what most people don't realise is, we don't, for example, with a dog, would we need a pair of Jack Russells, Bulldogs, German Shepherds, etc.? No, we would only need one wolf kind pair with much genetical variation, like a mongrel, for example. We know that the different breeds of dogs come from one wolf-like dog, and this happened only a few thousand years ago. That's clearly not evolution, but variation within kind, something creation scientists and Christians have been hopping on for ages now.
Just to even add to that, it was actually Christian scientists who first came up with the phrase natural selection. It was actually a Christian concept, and mainly because of their belief in Noah's Ark, and that there were certain kinds that came, and now we see so many different species from that kind, and they knew that there had to be some variation at some point. Yeah.
It's crazy. So the misunderstanding in people's minds due to poor illustrations and the like is every single species, and there's, I think it's in the millions now, I think 6.8 million different species of animals. And so what people think is there was like 30 different kinds of snakes, 50 different types of horses, which there are different species and speciation, as it were, within horses. But the reality is they would have only have needed one kind of horse, which would have then given way for the different species. Christians have also always believed in microevolution, simply because it's unavoidable. The reality is God makes it clear that He made them orange trees. And how variations in them. There are hundreds of different types of peoples, let alone different types of animals, and all of this is because there's variation in those kinds, but all of them point to there being one genotype, as it were, and all of them flowing from that within their own kinds, and obviously which gives way to their own species. And so I continue, conservative estimates by researchers on kinds and genus types of animals say that there would have been about 8,000 kinds, and therefore about 16,000 individual animals. So if you round it up, and let's just give a conservative rounded number, let's say 30,000 animals would have needed to be on the Ark, which goes to our second question, which a lot of these people again don't think through. What would have been the average size of an animal on the Ark? Now remember, the Genesis account specifies that only land-breathing animals would have been on the Ark. So that takes away your sea creatures, insects, bugs, which is an insect, and all those sorts of things. Particularly
as there's more different kinds of insects than there are land-breathing animals. So the host suggested, if all the bugs alone were on the Ark, it would have sank, but there were no insects because they weren't specified as being as animals that were on the Ark.
There you go. And so I wrote, also a great misconception is that Noah would have taken I've already mentioned every species as a reference already. That would have been impossible, but he would have taken a representative from every kind. Now, a lot of research has to be done to scale down the animals. Reality that we know, these animals would not have need to be fully grown. And as I say, so given the average size of an animal that would have been on the ark would be smaller than the size, or essentially would have been smaller than the size of a sheep when put all together, there wouldn't have needed to be they wouldn't have needed to take fully grown animals, like fully grown elephants or giraffes and the like, because the text doesn't say it, and it would make more sense to have younger animals who'd be naturally stronger. So for argument's sake, let's go with all the animals being the size of a sheep. So the third question is, how big was the ark actually? And I think this is the million-dollar question, really. The pictures we have, especially some sadly in churches and most books on it, is we have a little rubber ducky looking boat, and we have animals having their heads stuck outside the windows, which is
taking up the sun.
Yeah, you know, as you do on the boat on the cruise. And so the ark was 50 cubits high and its width was also 30 cubits. Now a cubit is the length between the tip of the hand to an elbow, which can be as short as 17 inches. An American football field and a half, which is big to say the least. That would store over 500 railway cars on the ark also. And researchers also found that one railway car, as it were, can hold up to 220 sheep. And in another video, you can do the maths. And so yeah, there would be more than enough size for them. It was one of the videos will talk about the cubits space, the volume in the ark, the space, all those things. And I think one of the main things people miss out as well is that there was also food on it. But we'll get into that in a second. So my last question is, how many animals would have been on the ark and would they fit? So as we've seen already, about 30 animals would have been on the ark. Given that the average size of a given that
how many animals?
30,000.
30,000.
On average, we can't fully say, but that is even rounding up to quite high. Given that the average size of a sheep, given that the animals are the average size of a sheep, given the size of the ark and the fact that it also had 3 levels, gives it even more space. It's also estimated that over 120,000 sheep could fit in the ark. So given a conservative number of 30,000, we see all of the animals could. And so if you answer the right questions, you get the right answers. These people don't answer the right questions. They're not looking for the right answers because they don't want to hear it. They just, it's all fancy. It's a fairy tale, as it were. And what I wrote in summation is that would have been enough space for the animals, for food, for water, and also enough space to deal with all the excrement which would have come from the animals without them being killed by the butane gas, as which was referred to in the video, in the program, which was nonsense. I mean, reality is there would have been provision for dealing with those things. And I think one of the other things, reality, that Noah had over 100 years to build this ark, which a lot of people don't really, consider and think through. He had a long time to put into preparation. The other reality is that God brought him the animals. It wasn't though he went out searching for the animals and had to get the right size, and God brought these animals. And I think this is one of the main things which you're going to get onto, is a matter of worldview. From a biblical worldview, if God is who he says he is, all powerful, all knowing, sovereign, all of these things are a misnomer. It's not a big thing for him. But obviously, even given the bare evidential facts, we see it's possible that these animals could have fit in. But the reality is, it's also a supernatural event. The reality that animals were brought to him, God closed the ark. All of these things point to the reality that it was the Lord who done it. But we see clearly there would have been enough time, there would have been enough space, there would have been enough animals, there would have been enough kinds that would have given forth to all the species and types of animals we have today.
That's fairly summed up, and there'll be a video in the description as well that goes through everything we've said with a lot more animation to it.
Which always helps.
Right, a third question. So we heard it alluded in the show that there is solid proof for evolution, and that the fact that not everybody believes in it is quite quite strange almost. So they made it sound like there's solid proof, it's a done deal, there's no discussion on it. So I guess my third question is, does evolution have solid proof?
And I think this is, again, what we find in there is when you have a presupposition that says that something is true, you're not, one, willing to hear the evidence of the other side, and two, you dismiss there being another side completely. And this is what we find with these aggressive, atheistic type of liberalism, as it were, because we've all somehow figured that evolution is a fact. He even quoted 99% of scientists say it's a fact, you know. And I think one of the things in my mind that struck straight away was reality that a couple hundred years ago, 99 if not 100% of supposed scientists would have said the world was flat. And that would have been a fact then, would it not? And yet, given the same weight of argumentation, people are not thinking through these matters and just sort of saying, well, science says it, it must be true. Dawkins says it, it must be true. My microbiologist says it, it must be true, without really giving thought to the facts. And
just to even add that, saying science says something is actually a logical fallacy. Science can't speak, science can't say anything. So yeah, whenever that argument is used, it's actually logically incorrect.
And I think one of the things Christians have been asking for years now, ever since Darwinian evolution, as it were, made its way into mainstream society and thought, was, what is the evidence? Now, what we usually find is the fossil record, and we go, okay, what about it? And so I usually ask, and what we find is, in the fossil records, what we're meant to see, if evolution is true, we're meant to see transitional fossils. That is, fossils that clearly show one kind, as it were, transitioning into another. If evolution, which teaches that life as we know it today was formed from a single life cell in water, as it were, then we should see how that cell then took on information which we never see, as it were, and would be able to then, once forming that information, given animals and human types and all these things we have to human people we have today, we would see one group of fossils transitioning into another. However, when we looked at fossil record, what we find is all the fossils are fully formed fossils in their own right. So that these are fully formed animals. These are not transitional fossils from a horse to an elephant, as it were, from a fish to a bear. And usually when you throw out that sort of argumentation, what we usually find from evolution is this, well, that's not what we're saying. But then we say, what are you saying? How do we have different types and kinds and species of animals forming from one single life cell? And usually the argument falls flat. And whenever pressed for evidence, what we find is, for example, Darwin's finches, and what we have there is variation within kind. That's speciation. Christians and creationists have always believed that. We find, I remember a lady, Ray Comfort, done an actual video on evolution, and he went to California, spoke to the top scientists professors in those universities, and we find evolution in terms of bacteria. And what he asked her was, what did the new bacteria become? She said, bacteria. And he says, there you go. that is microevolution, as it were. We never find evidence of one type of animal, one type of genetic information being transferred and taken on all sorts of new information, becoming another.
Characteristics.
Yeah. And so when we talk about proof, there hardly is any. And I mean, there's a number of different arguments and questions for evolutionists to think through, but one of the main things that come to my mind is, given the fact that evolution would promote, and as Dawkins and others have said, would promote selfism, as it were, you know, the reality that we would want, as people especially, we want to get our genes and our information onto another. We want to survival of the fittest, you know, we want to protect ourselves and all those things. Why is it, if I was to see even someone I disliked, you know, a lot, I'd see them in some sort of, you know, immediate pain or immediate danger, there'd be an instinct, whether acting it or not is another thing, to go out and help them. Where does altruism, which is the desire to help people, come from? Where does feelings of compassion and mercy and all these sorts of things come from, if we are just mere products of evolution? It doesn't make sense. And that's why I think reality is, we find not only from nature but from real experience that we are made in Imago Dei, in the image of God. That's where all of these feelings and desires and emotions come from. But that's not the question. But yeah, I mean, the question is, what is the evidence for evolution? I've asked a number of people, and usually it's because it's accepted. Why don't you accept it too? And we just go, because there's no evidence. And what's the evidence for creation or intelligent design? And there's hundreds and there's loads, you know. But again, you don't ask the right questions, you never get the right answers. So yeah.
Right. Let's move on to the fourth question now. And so the title of the show was does the evidence, again talking about that word evidence, does the evidence undermine God? And so the fourth question I'm going to be asking is, why does the atheistic worldview preclude an answer to the very question of the title?
Yeah, and I think just to clarify, if anyone's sort of going, what? Because that was quite a few big words. The reality is, atheism obviously teaches is the understanding that there is no God. Now, in such a show which then asks for evidence, that does evidence undermine religion is the question actually, and obviously evidence from religion would obviously come from God, as it were, or a God. Obviously from the Christian worldview, there's only one true God. But what they do is similar and akin to what some Muslims do in dialogue. So for example, they'd say, give me one scripture there Jesus says, I am God, worship me, and I'll become a Christian, or something of that sort. And the reality is, they've read the Bible enough to realise there is no such passage. And so they ask the question presupposing the reality that there is no truth in the answer you'd give them. And so they then determine, well, he can't be. And in the same way, does evidence undermine religion? It doesn't matter how much evidence you'd give to an atheist, as it were. He's not after evidence. He has already a pre-held presupposition that there is no God, regardless of what the evidence says. And this is the thing, again, I was even going to say about evolution. An evolutionary scientist and a creation scientist will come to the same evidence and will come to different conclusions given their worldviews. So for example, there's a number, I mean, even we look at the fossil record. How is it that we have such a rapid fossilization of animals? Sometimes animals are fossilized rather even trying to eat another. Now a creation scientist looks at it and says, given a Noahic flood, we see that there would have been such a quick compression, as it were, of the waters rushing in, that would give way to the fossils being the animals being immediately fossilized in that way and preserved perfectly as well. Whereas an evolutionary scientist may say, well, it could have been the Ice Age. The reality that the whole face of the earth had ice on it, which is a big stretch, as it were, but in reality they deny the Noahic flood covering the whole earth, but they don't deny that ice could have at one point in time covered the whole earth. And so what I'm saying is we're looking at the same things, but we're coming to different conclusions given our own worldviews. Now the problem with, in reality, in this sort of talk show, there is an agenda. Regardless of how many people they like to get on there to show, well, we're very inclusive, we have all these different worldviews. They usually have a leftist, liberal, atheistic panel, and the questions are not questions that are going to really get people to rationally think through the evidence. The evidence is that Christians and apologists and all these sort of people have been putting out there for years. The presupposition is, for like the lady scholar said, well, even commenting on Jesus, well, we don't know. It's just to dispel and dismiss the evidence before you even get there. So before you even at the table of, okay, well, hold on, let's talk about this. The argument is already laid flat. Their agenda is put forward, and usually, one of the main things thrown around is, we don't know. So stop going on like you do. And so it's inherent within their own worldviews to put forth their agendas and their atheistic understanding, even in those questions. So does evidence undermine religion? You're not looking for evidence, real evidence. Even that question presupposes that there's somehow evidence out there that undermines religion anyway,
or that is capable of undermining religion.
And so from that standpoint, you're not willing to engage in the facts and materials and evidences that people of faith, especially Christians, would bring to the table of ideas for rational, logical, coherent conversation. And so that's how I would answer that one.
That kind of leads us on to our fifth and final question, and that is, does everybody have a presupposition? So that is, does everybody have a preset kind of mindset towards certain things, so that when they look at it, they've kind of got a set of glasses that they look at the world through?
And I think programs like that show that more than anything else. When somebody given the weight of evidence for the historicity of Jesus says, we don't know, we see presuppositions laid bare and come out, as it were. And I mean, the reality is everyone has a presupposition, everyone has a worldview, everyone operates out of a worldview, everyone has a moral code, everyone has all of these things that we take for granted. Everyone has a sense of truth. Everyone has obviously a moral code, sense of right and wrong. The question becomes, where does it come from? Where do you get your own personal presuppositions from? And there are a number of things that shape and mold it, but the reality is we all have one, whether you like it or not. And so when somebody comes to the table of ideas, as it were, a table of discussion, and begins to sprout forth what they believe, that's all coming from a presupposition. And I think that the failure in these sorts of programs is to realize, okay, we all have pre-held views. Now, the reality is, people can have the wrong pre-held views and people can have right pre-held views. And that should be where the thrust of the arguments and points is laid at, and how one can epistemologically get to where and epistemology is essentially a study of truth. Reality, no one there made a statement that they wouldn't think was true. Even when they say they don't know, that's a statement they believe to be true. Or they wouldn't make it. Every statement one makes is from their own personal standpoint a fact statement. So even when she says, well, I don't know whether Jesus existed or not, and I don't care, there you go. You have a worldview that presupposes I'm not too sure whether Jesus is or not, even though there's all this evidence out there. I just don't know, but I don't care. That's your presupposition coming out. So whether he does or not, as you said, has no bearing on your life. You're not religious in any way, shape or form, so it doesn't matter to you. That shows forth that your worldview presupposes, even if he did exist, I would, as a scholar, which is someone who obviously translates ancient languages into languages, English languages or other languages, even if there is the evidence out there, because my worldview, is so strong and obviously goes with my understanding, my rationale, and all those sorts of things, I wouldn't care. So the reality is, obviously, a believer, as the reality is, for the atheist, without God, as it were, they need to be able to demonstrate how they can come to conclusions about what is right and wrong, because without God you can't make those statements. You can't even make statements for truth. So for example, they claim, well, we all know that evolution is true. Where do you get truth from? What's your basis? And the point is, their worldview governs their thinking. Their worldview obviously states evolution is fact, whereas for a number of years it was only claimed as a theory. And now somehow we've advanced and we've evolved and we've got to the place where we can now say evolution is a fact. Why? Because all the scientists say so. And so what we find is the worldview that is bent over and given to superiority in the area of science over religion, and that gives way to a number of things, namely in something Al-Mullah's has been saying, when liberalism and secularism rules the day, it opens a vacuum that must be filled. And obviously in the West, there's been the wholesale abandonment of Christian religion. we find a militant Islam rising, because in societies, once secularism, rules the day, and that's this sort of everyone's entitled to their own opinion. However, Christians will be marginalised because they are the ones that will not, as it were, bend the knee to Rome or to any governing authorities over the scriptures, and I think that's the main point. A true believer's mind is governed by what the Word of God says. And so when the Word of God says that homosexuality is a sin and that marriage is defined between a man and a woman, that's an objective standard that's not open to change. However, given the liberalism and secularism, there's always going to be variation and change. So, for example, not too long ago in this very country we're in, homosexuality was a crime. That would have ended one in prison, that would have put one in a medical institution. Whereas now it's celebrated, and the reality is, if you do not celebrate it with them, you're now the criminal. And the scriptures obviously says, woe to those who call good evil and evil good. But the reality is, there's been an advancement and a change of worldviews given the same evidence. So 50, 60 years ago, there was obviously people that were liberal, that were anti-theistic, but they would have seen marriage obviously as consistent and being between a man and a woman. The evidence hasn't changed. The evidence, there was always men and men, women and women, desiring marriage, desiring, union, as it were, together. The evidence hasn't changed, the worldviews have. So now when governments and people come together and they think about these matters, given their new worldviews or the advancement of a more leftist, liberal, God-hating worldview, we see that the views have now changed, and they're more open and even forthcoming to a more anti-biblical position, which Romans 1 obviously teaches, as it were, being abandoned by God. They're left to their own thinking and they become foolish and futile in their thinking. And so everyone has a worldview. It's just a matter of whether one's worldview can be rightly answered for, as it were. And most people can't, on basic questions, they can't give you the answers for their own worldviews. And that's how I would answer that.
And I think even just to add on top of that, something that one of the I think he was a scientist, or he was an atheist, I believe, in the show said that we can't necessarily know anything to be absolutely true. And
is that true?
They would, even that statement raises the question, how do you know that is true? But in their own kind of position, they can't really say that there is no God absolutely, because they can't say anything to be absolutely true. It's like they're very contradictory. They will say to Christians, how can you believe in a God? Yet they themselves do not have any way to raise that objection. And the truth is, without an objective standard, without someone who gives an objective, for example, moral standard, we can't have any moral absolutes. You can't say that a crime is a crime, really, without having an objective standard to appeal to say in every situation that would be wrong. And the very fact that we know people hold to objective standards is the fact that if you were to ask anybody, if a 50-year-old raped a 4-year-old, would it be wrong? Everybody would say yes. But if there is no moral objective and someone else comes along and says, no, I think it's all right, how can you actually say that is wrong? How can you say that what they have done is wrong? And I'm not saying how can you say that it's a crime, because that's just merely saying that it's against the law. I'm saying, how can you say it's morally wrong? And without a moral objective standard, without God, you can't account for moral absolutes. You can't account for things such as logic or rationality or any of those kind of things that exist outside us that are transcendent. Without a moral objective standard, without an objective absolute lawgiver who we believe is the God of Scriptures, then we can't account for anything. And your worldview almost it's bankrupt. There's no real standard to it. I think that's all I'd add to that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So I think we've gone through five objections. There were so many more things we could have spoken about, but for the sake of time, we've left them out. And who knows, maybe in future weeks they may get raised, and we may make another video addressing some of the things.
So yeah, if you like, if you enjoy the video, please like. We will try and do videos responding maybe every week.
We'll try
to the big questions live, because I know a lot of Christians, if you do end up watching it, you're left frustrated. And I think one of the main problem is that if there is a conservative Bible believing person, there's usually only one, and usually you're, as a Bible believing person, you're sort of left thinking, is he really representing our side? And so we want to do these videos to try to encourage believers who watch that there are answers out there. You know, don't really see thinking these people are the best, or people who really know what they're talking about. Most of the time they're not. They're usually ill-informed, and again with a biased worldview. So if you enjoy the videos, please like, please share, please comment, and have a blessed day.
Thanks.
Thank you.